All right, aloha everyone. I want to welcome you once again to the Queen's Free Speaking of Health lecture series. Tonight's lecture is called Planning for Your Future Healthcare. My name is Sean Ibarra from the Corporate Communications Department here at the Queen's Health Systems. So our presenter this evening is Dr. Michael Tom. He is a geriatrician at the Queen's Medical Center. He was born and raised in Honolulu and graduated from Punahou School. He went on to attend college at Stanford University and then returned home for medical school at the John A. Burns School of Medicine. He stayed in Hawaii for his training in internal medicine and was selected as chief resident, and then finished his training in geriatric medicine. He is passionate about preventative care for kupuna and quality improvement. He likes to spend his free time hiking and surfing with his girlfriend. So please, let's give a warm welcome to Dr. Michael Tom.
Well, I want to share my appreciation for everyone who decided to come here tonight. I think it's really important. It's a topic I'm certainly passionate about, and I think that it's valuable to invest and think about this for yourself or for your loved ones. And some of the reasons that some of you may have paid attention to the KHON news clip on Monday morning, but some of the reasons that it's important to do this is that it's kind of like thinking about planning for your financial future, right? You think about your retirement, your nest egg, how you'll do after you retire from your job. And so this is a very similar thing. You know, if something should happen, how will your needs get taken care of and what's important to you? And it's always important. I think a lot of people talk about insurance and things like that. Accidents can happen to anyone, and serious illness, whether that be cancer, a stroke, dementia. It's really important to think about, well, what if that were to happen to me? And it can be very scary to think about those kinds of things. I think we're in America especially, we try to be positive and think about all the good that can come out of things, but it is important to plan for unfortunate things that may happen. Some statistics that may be helpful for kind of framing this, like why is it worth talking about this, is because it is fairly common. 1 in 3 kupuna are affected by some type of dementia, and Alzheimer's is the 6th leading cause of death in America, while stroke is the #1 cause of chronic disability. Someone ends up with a stroke, they lose function on one side of their body. That can be very disabling, and so it is important to be aware of those statistics as well. And what about the flip side? Your loved one becomes affected. Well, in Hawaii, 1 out of 6 adults are caregivers, caring for somebody, whether it be their spouse, whether it be a parent. It's very important. It could even be a child. I have some of my patients who care for their children who have lived with disabilities all their lives, or even in the middle of their life. So nearly half of those adults who are caregivers are caring for a parent or an in-law, and a lot of people are out there, they're worried because they actually expect in the next 2 years, they see the signs in their loved one, and they think that they'll become a caregiver themselves in 2 years. So how do you start taking the steps to plan for the future? Well, I think the first thing to think about is, when you're thinking about yourself or you're thinking about a loved one, is what are some of the normal things that you may see as a serious illness starts to advance and get worse over time? I think this picture is very helpful because it highlights some of the different scenarios. So you can see in the upper left in A, the y-axis talks about function and the x-axis talks about time. So in the situation A, that's an example of someone who unfortunately passes away from a tragic accident. They get into a car accident, something happens, they're very high functioning, and all of a sudden they pass away. There's certainly grief to be had, it's an unexpected thing, but no one's becoming a caregiver, and you're not dealing with the side effects from the serious illness, other than the grief and the loss of a loved one. B, on the upper right, that's a different scenario. That's where we're talking about a very serious illness like cancer, a terminal illness where things change very rapidly. One day, doing very well, and then you start to not feel so good. You go to your doctor, they do diagnostic tests, they find out you do have cancer, or your loved one has cancer, and things do okay. In the early parts, you're able to still go about a lot of your normal activity, But as the disease progresses, assuming that it's a cancer that unfortunately advances and there's not much treatment left to cure the cancer, often there's a very rapid decline in function, and that can be very scary for folks, but it's very rapid. I think one of the things that's very unsaid and not really talked about well in not only in Hawaii, but probably nationwide, is the idea of organ failure, and that's in the bottom left, C. And that's talking about things like whether it be liver disease, heart disease, lung disease. Some people may be familiar with terms like heart failure or COPD. These are examples of organ failure or chronic organ illness. And what we see is you can see the up and down nature of it. You start pretty good, you get really sick, you get hospitalized, things are looking very bad, but with the support of medical treatment, a lot of people start turning the corner, they start feeling better. And in the early parts, you're able to kind of come back to a fairly high level. But with each subsequent or next event, you see that each hospitalization or event take its toll on the body, and you see that slow down, and it's much harder every time to really come back to that full function. And that's very frustrating, I think, for the individual as well as for the family. Like, why can't my loved one get better? Like, why aren't they going back to how they were before? I think it's hard when you see in the early stages, you see that bounce back, and you're like, oh, is that how it will be every time? And unfortunately, with a lot of those illnesses, that's not the case, and we see that overall trajectory of going down in function. One of the harder ones too that we see is in the bottom right, and that's letter D, and the idea of this frailty that we see with older age, and in particular, a really good example is dementia, where we're already at a point where the function, we've recognized that, wow, with anything that could happen, we see that really slow decline in function. And we kind of see it, oh, there may be good days and bad days, and we may have long periods of things seem to be okay, and then we kind of think, wow, it was just only 6 months ago that mom still was able to walk, and now I can't even place it quite on my tongue or in my brain, but now she's really struggling to walk. We're pushing her around in a wheelchair more often. She's really talking a lot less than she used to. So that's the idea of frailty in this decline when someone's at an advanced age. So hopefully happy to answer questions about that afterwards and kind of that idea, but I think a lot of people are much more familiar with scenario B. I think that's much more talked about is when someone has cancer or something like that and you see that rapid decline. So I think one thing that's very hard, this is a very personal, and I think in Hawaii especially culturally, it's a very family-oriented, culturally oriented idea and set of values. And what does that mean? We're talking about living with an advanced serious illness. So when we think about function, a lot of people focus on physical, which is certainly important, but it's very holistic. We want to think about their emotional state, their mental state, their spiritual state, and those things will change often for a lot of people once that physical part starts declining in function. A lot of the other elements also start getting worse too. If you think about it, right, you're not able to go outside anymore, you're not able to see your friends, maybe not be able to attend religious service. That can be very daunting for a person as an individual and also for the family. They kind of see that isolation that a lot of our kapuna see when they don't have that physical ability to go outside. And when we talk about what's important in values, we also think about treatment. And I think a lot of people, and myself included, we want to see our healthcare system, our hospitals, our doctor's office, elsewhere as places of healing, as getting better. But when you're living with an advanced serious illness, it becomes, the scales start to tip, and we start to see where with these hospitalizations, with treatment, we start seeing more negative or adverse or bad side effects. And we start having to think about, well, when I go to the hospital, I expect to get better, and I hope I get better, but sometimes that starts with repeat visits to the hospital. We don't always see that, and we see maybe mom or dad start to, wow, really seems to get confused every time that they go to the hospital, and really never seems quite the same. It's very challenging, almost like a different personality. And so those are also important things to think about when you think about well, what do I want for myself? What do I want for my loved one? Is that challenge worth the benefit of potential, a small gain in healing? And so that's a very personal decision that certainly we encourage people to talk amongst their own family, but also with their doctor and their specialists, and about those relationships as well. And we move into this period when you're living with an advanced serious illness, having to think about acceptance. So what is my identity? I can think of several patients of mine where for a lot of my patients, they really enjoy gardening. That's really important to them. And so if they know that they will never return to a point where they can do that gardening, that is a big quality of life check-in moment for them. And thinking about, well, if I can't do the things I love, then maybe I don't want to seek that aggressiveness of care that I might have 5 years ago when I could garden all the time. Versus I've had a gentleman, tell me that, Doc, what's most important to me is watching my San Francisco 49ers every weekend. And if I'm in bed all the time, that doesn't matter. As long as I get to watch my sports, that's what's important. So everyone comes in with their own set of values. And it's really challenging. I think in Hawaii, especially culturally, we want to be respectful. We don't want to step on other people's toes and upset other people. So we will often aim to please our own family. And some people may want to do certain things. But I think as a healer and as a physician, I really always try to tie it back to the individual, the one who has the serious illness, and what is their value system, what's important to them. And so always trying to circling back and putting that at the center. It's certainly important to include other people's input because you may be at a point where your loved one can't communicate their values very well. So having to rely on family, yourselves to look back and like, well, historically, Mom really cared about these things. And so I think we should try to honor that. And then talking about transitions, I think with advanced serious illness, similar to the previous slide where we see those transitions, how do we deal with those and how does that shape and change our values? So one of the hardest parts, I think, is having the conversation. Part of that is having documentation, paperwork that has that, but part of it is the actual doing of having the conversation. That's very challenging. So to start off, I think, well, why do I even want to go down that road of creating the paperwork? Well, it's important because in this modern era, medical technology really allows us to sustain life. What the quality of that life is very subjective and personal, but it does allow us to sustain life. And again, one thing that's not unique to Hawaii, but is true in Hawaii, is that our law states that if someone does not have a power of attorney for healthcare, then technically all interested parties, Uncle Rudy, Auntie Honeybee, all of those folks, whoever, cousin, Keola from the Big Island, or who's been on the mainland for 5 years and then comes back all of a sudden and he hears that grandma's sick. Technically, all interested parties have to reach a consensus. And so while most of the time, a lot of my patients have said that I want all my children to come together and make a decision. In the majority of cases, it works out well. Everyone gets on the same page. But in my experience, I've seen too many cases where there's a disagreement and it really stalls the care and unfortunately leads to a lot of fighting and leads to probably suffering on the part of the individual who has the illness. And so while putting a power of attorney doesn't necessarily mean that you don't want other people involved, it does protect you from that scenario of having people fight over what your values are and what your wishes are for that phase of your life. So that's why it's important to fill out advanced healthcare directive. And what's also important is talking to your family or having that conversation, because I've also run into the scenario where, oh yeah, I did what my doctor told me and I filled one out, I did what my lawyer told me, and then they become seriously ill, can no longer communicate, and their loved one, who is the power of attorney, had no idea they were the power of attorney. Zero clue. And they walk into the situation, very high emotions, very scary, and they're expected to know everything about their family member, never having had any sort of conversation about any type of scenario, and they're left with the task of guessing what their loved one want. And that's a very frightening thing, I think, for anyone who's a power of attorney. And that's why I encourage having that conversation. So you may be asking, well, sounds great. That sounds very logical and a reason why I should have one, but how do I even start talking about that? Well, walking through this form, some of you may be familiar with this form. This is Advanced Healthcare Directive. There are many versions. Your attorney may have a different version that includes a lot more, but this is a standard one that's available through the state and through various nonprofit organizations. The star really focuses on naming that agent. So really that's probably the most critical thing on this form, above all else other than making it official, is having that power of attorney. The second part, which is talking about things like if I become seriously ill and I can't communicate, do I want relief from pain? Those things are important. A lot of people fill those out. What I see blank a lot of the time is this box that has is highlighted by the red rectangle and the blue arrow. That part is often blank. There's a reason there's a lot of space there. And a lot of that is because to kind of lay out some of those values. For example, I have one patient who has a bad lung disease. She lived at home for a long time with a machine, but she could still communicate, and she had expressed to her family, I really want continued medical care as long as I could communicate with hand gestures. That's very important, is able to communicate that. So that was an example of being very specific and kind of drawing a line, because the part with the checkboxes is often very generic and really looks at a point that is at a point where a lot of people make that decision, I don't think I would want continued medical care. But it's all that in-between stuff that's very challenging and very personal. So that's why it's important to talk about it. A lot of people also ask, well, what's the difference between an advanced healthcare directive and a living will? And what's a POLST? And what about burial wishes and things like that? I found this really nice graphic from a South African nonprofit, and it shows this umbrella. So the umbrella is your advanced healthcare directive. And under that umbrella are different sections, some of which include a living will. And a living will kind of talks about the same things as in this form about pain relief and artificial nutrition. But the other things in your advanced healthcare directive that you can talk about are things like having that medical proxy or a power of attorney, even your burial wishes, whether you're an organ donor, whether you would want to have CPR performed on you. Those are things that would all go under a healthcare directive. And that's why it's very challenging, because there's a lot of different versions of the form out there, some of which include some of these and some of which include only all of them. And so it's important to think about those things as you move forward. This green form, that's construction green, well, it's not that bright on the screen, but this is what we call a provider orders for life-sustaining treatment. And the intention of this form is not that everyone needs to have one, and it's really meant for people who have advanced serious illness where maybe CPR is not in their best interest. And so really, who's going to be doing CPR? That's the folks that you call when you call 911. They look for this form when they come in the door, when they respond to a 911 call, and they use that as a guide for what they're going to do to try to help in that situation. It can also be used to help the rest of your healthcare team, but in an ideal situation, that is what a living will or an advanced healthcare directive does, is that document really helps your entire healthcare team, your doctor, the hospital team, whomever, your specialist, your family, make those decisions because you're still alive. That's why it's called a living will. You're still alive. And so making those decisions. Well, some people may ask also, well, why wouldn't I want CPR? I think that's a tough question. That's a very personal thing to think about. Part of the challenge is that the media, and it's no fault of their own, they want to show a good story, but unlike in TV and movies where a lot of people, when they get CPR, do well, think of movies like Kill Bill or other shows like ER, people do well and they come back to life and they walk out the hospital door 2 days later. Very different in reality. Unfortunately, we are not there yet with our CPR, and most people do not have a good outcome. And by good outcome, I mean minimal brain damage and effect, where they can walk out of the hospital and still interact with people in a meaningful way. So because that is a low statistic, some people would choose, well, if my heart stops or I stop breathing, that seems natural. At some point, we all will have that happen to us. And if that's the case, then I do not want to go with that low statistic of CPR and potentially have a lot of things done to me in the hospital. I'd rather pass away naturally. So that's something to consider. Again, I really encourage you to talk to your family, talk to your doctor about what that means, and am I someone who maybe CPR is not a good idea? Again, how do you have this conversation with your loved one? Very normal to feel uncomfortable. Can't emphasize that enough. It's hard. This is a serious topic. Sometimes it's rooted in cultural beliefs that if you talk about it, it speaks it into existence or possibility. That's fine. That's your belief system. But I think trying to move past that, and in my experience, when someone hasn't had that conversation, it makes it much harder because there's a lot more guessing, a lot more I don't know, a lot more indecision, anxiety, fear at the moment, versus if you talk about it when things are good, when you can, if things seem scary, take a break, revisit it next week, revisit it in a month, revisit it in a year. It's okay. This document can be updated as frequently or as little as you want to. And it is normal to talk about it. And there are guides, certain phrases, coaches even, who can kind of help through that process. The folks at Kukua Mau who are outside and have their table are very experienced in helping to guide that discussion. I also want to talk about some myths and truths because there are a lot out there, and a lot of them surround palliative care and hospice care. So hopefully this is helpful because it clears up some misunderstandings. One is that hospice and palliative care are very similar in that they overlap. As you can see in this bottom right diagram, that palliative care kind of encompasses everything, and that the goal is really to help treat symptoms, make people feel better, and improve their quality of life. And hospice does the same thing. The major difference is that hospice is a narrower focus and is for a specific population and group of people who are not expected, because of their serious illness, to live less than 6 months. Now, I put that asterisk, that star there, because for a lot of people, it's much shorter. And then for some people, it's much longer. They live a lot longer than 6 months, and some people will even graduate from hospice. Hospice is a service that's provided by an agency. There's multiple here on Oahu and several on the neighbor islands. And palliative care is something that is a growing field, but still much needed here in Hawaii. But they are really helping to bridge that journey from where you're feeling pretty good day in to day out with your serious illness, and then as things progress, more the symptoms become harder to control, and palliative care is really focused on that bridge or that transition from feeling good to starting feeling not so good and nearing the end of life. Common myths. Hospice is not intended to speed up someone's death. Can't emphasize, so a lot of people fear that once they go on hospice, that means they're going to die sooner. One thing is that there are multiple studies that have shown that the average person on hospice actually lives longer than a similar person who's not on hospice. I think a lot of people fear hospice because they talk to either their friends or family, and they find out, their family member had gone on hospice and died a few days later. The sad reality is that for a lot of those people, if they were not on hospice, they may have died sooner, or they would have died in the same amount of time. Having someone on longer on hospice allows time for the team to help start looking at those symptoms. How do we make people feel better? If they're given a short amount of time so close to that final day, there's not a lot of time to work with someone, and so they do pass anyway. So want to help kind of dispel that myth. A lot of people also fear that if they go on hospice, they're going to be shoved into some sort of home, whether it be a foster home or a nursing facility. And the vast majority of people actually receive their hospice care at home. It's so important. We want to honor people's wishes. The vast majority of people, when you survey them, if they were to pass away, they'd want to pass away at home, not in a hospital, not in a nursing facility, at home. And hospice always aims to try to accomplish that goal. Hospice is pretty much a free benefit. If you have Medicare, you get hospice. If you have any commercial insurance, you get hospice. If you have Medicaid, you get hospice. It's really the young person who is underinsured and suddenly gets ill that may run into that loophole, but usually once you're in the hospital getting treatment and you get diagnosed, then they'll do emergency insurance and make that happen. So I've never in my experience had someone not get hospice when they wanted hospice. One big question is, because someone's seriously ill, they're often very frail, and so caregiving becomes a big part of that. Unfortunately, hospice does not cover that 24/7 caregiving, but in certain circumstances, there are options. Certainly, if your loved one or yourself, you're a veteran, you should certainly try to enroll in the VA system, because depending on your service, you may benefit for those things. And certain hospice agencies do have home type facilities where when someone is really making that transition to the last days or week of life, and the caregiving becomes so intense, the symptoms become so intense that it's overwhelming for the family. They do have facilities, but it's very limited, and they really try to have space open for those cases, and so they have to be very selective of who enters their facilities. I mentioned this on the previous slide, but people do graduate. I have several patients where, because of that intense care, specialty care from a hospice agency, they actually end up maybe gaining weight, feeling a lot better, and they're very stable, and they end up graduating. And different agencies have different ways of celebrating that graduation, but it is definitely a time to celebrate. And people can always, if things change in the future, always re-enroll in hospice. I do want to touch on one thing which is a very common concern of families, which is about nutrition at the end of life. I think a lot of people are fearful that their loved one stops eating, they're losing weight, or both. And they fear that, well, if I can't feed them, am I starving them? Am I torturing them? I think it's important to recognize that in a lot of advanced serious illness, we see this common pathway, and that's what we call cachexia. And that's a state where, because the disease is so advanced, it causes a chain reaction, well, not a chain reaction, but a reaction in the body where it really shuts down a lot of the normal processes. And really, they are not able to absorb nutrients. Even if they're eating well, 100% every meal, you can't give them enough food. Their body cannot absorb those nutrients. And so that is part of a lot of disease processes and something to be aware of. Resources. I think this is the big thing. I think a lot of people feel blindsided when they're faced with a serious illness and don't know where to turn to. And they feel like maybe the whirlwind of the hospitalization, maybe somebody said something, maybe somebody said nothing, but then before they know it, they're discharged from the hospital and they're not really sure what to do. You're not alone. For starters, there are multiple organizations here in Hawaii. One of the most common ones is Alzheimer's Association, but there are specific associations and societies for different serious illnesses, Parkinson's, Lou Gehrig's disease. A lot of these societies, they meet, loved ones can go to support groups, get ideas. Some of the best ideas come from fellow family, very creative. It's kind of like the life hacks. They find ways to help their loved one in creative ways that certainly us on the healthcare team don't always think of. And that's important. Certainly the state recognizes with our kapuna and our aging population the need, so they put out on their website and also a booklet that I think we have outside that talks about the various resources. The unfortunate thing is that for a lot of these guides and websites, they have to try to avoid bias. So it's a great list of things, but I think what a lot of people want to know is they want to, like similar to picking a restaurant, yeah, you can go and look at this list of all these restaurants, but you want to know which one's the good one. And so they have to remain free of bias. It's very similar to ourselves as healthcare professionals too. We can't necessarily always provide that advice. We can give certain, if we do give advice, we'll kind of give at least 3 so it appears like we're not biased. And one of the best ways is people use Coconut Wireless. They talk to family, they talk to friends, they find out from others, their support group. That's a great way to find good resources and get connected to private caregivers, caregiver agencies that they think that have worked well. Those are ways to kind of find the resources. If you have Quest or Medicaid, you have a service coordinator, sometimes they're busy. You have to be proactive and connect with them, and they are in charge of helping, and a lot of people do actually qualify for caregiving benefits if they have Quest or Medicaid. Kokua Kalihi Valley is a very special place. They have their own community, and they try very hard for the Kapuna to put into place, so they have resources as well. And certainly if you have long-term care insurance, that's something to review and see what your benefits are, because you think it may cover certain things, but a lot of policies exclude things. They may exclude long-term care in a facility. They may have long waiting periods before your benefits kick in. So various things that you should try to look into and make sure that you're aware of what your benefits are. So we're ending a little early, and I think that was actually on purpose on my part, because I expect hopefully some questions, and I'm happy to answer them. So we'll go ahead and take questions at this time. Is that okay, Sean?
So yeah, we'll open it up for questions now. So the volunteers in the back, if you have a question, just raise your hand, and we'll bring the microphone to you. We have 3 of them here in the front.
Perfect. Do you want to use that microphone? No. Oh, no, but for them. Oh, they have a separate one. Okay. Yes, sir.
Hi. You talked about CPR earlier.
Yes.
What is this low statistic you're referring to?
So it really depends on your age is a big factor, and your medical illnesses. So the more chronic or serious illnesses you have, it really drives down your success rate. And in general, if we're talking about the majority of adults in America, the success rate for what we consider success, which is having minimal brain damage and coming back to life with minimal brain damage, in general, for the American population, it would be somewhere between 10 to 15%. Yeah. In general, with the population that I work with, most people, their chances of having a good outcome from CPR is under 5%. And for a lot of them, it's under 1%. Yeah.
As a follow-up, I understand CPR is painful if it's administered properly. Can you tell me, does an unconscious person feel pain?
So, in unconscious, that's hard, because I think for a lot of people, when their heart has stopped, they're technically passed away, and we're trying to do life resuscitation. And so they may not feel it in the moment, but if we are able to bring back that heart and their brain has any sort of function, they will have pain, because in a lot of cases, especially in our Kapuna, good CPR results in broken ribs. And I hate to use that as a reason for why people shouldn't get CPR, because ribs can heal, we can treat pain with medicine, and so if that is their wish, that shouldn't necessarily be a reason. I think it's really thinking about the long-term effect of potentially living with significant brain damage, and your family having to, one, think about how to care for you, or even make decisions about your medical care if you're in a state where you have severe disability after being resuscitated or rescued from heart stopping. No.
But as far as pain is concerned, they wouldn't be able to feel it if they're unconscious.
When they're dead, I would expect not. It's hard because I've never been dead, so I can't tell you from personal experience, but I would not expect a dead person to feel pain. But if they come back, they're going to feel it. No.
I have a question about the poultice. I'm
Yes.
a little bit confused about what time frame it covers. So I was told by my doctor that The poultice is for the ambulance picks you up and takes you to the hospital. Once you get to the hospital, then your health directive kicks in, whatever it says over there. So it's a limited kind of time frame just to know what the ambulance people are going to do. And if I don't have one on my refrigerator, that means they're going to do whatever it takes to keep me alive during that time. And then when I get to the hospital, then if I'm brain dead or whatever it is that I don't want to have, food, water, whatever it says in my health directive, then that will kick in. So is that correct or not?
So that's a great question. So I'll clarify a few things. So it is true that this green POLST form is intended mainly for emergency personnel. So it's true. If you do not have this form and they cannot find it, so that's also important, is to have it somewhere visible. If they don't have one or they cannot find it, the default is for them to do CPR. If they find you in a state where you don't have a heartbeat or you're not breathing, they will do CPR. Now, if they come because a neighbor called and said, I haven't seen, Mrs. Nishikawa for 10 days, and they come in and they find Mrs. Nishikawa very cold and blue, they will not do CPR on someone who clearly has been dead for some time. But yes, if they come, the default is to do CPR if that is either what the green form indicates, or if you don't have one or they can't find one. The other stuff, so it's interesting because I think when this form was created, it was done in bits and pieces. So emergency personnel will not ever administer B or C. They're not going to make that decision about how much hospital care you get, or they're not going to immediately start trying to feed you in the community. That's going to be a decision in the hospital. So there are some states that have actually taken out some of those sections on the green form. Hawaii is not there yet, but some other states have taken those sections out because that doesn't matter to emergency personnel. That's what goes in the Advanced Healthcare Directive, correct? Yeah, correct. Now, some people like having the green form reflect those wishes too, because one, if myself or my team see that there's a discrepancy or a difference and it doesn't line up or add up or make sense, it probably means that either we have to do some more education and talk about it and revisit it, or maybe one's outdated and we want to try to realign things. It's also helpful because for the white form, technically it's a legal document, so you have to have it notarized, or you have to have it witnessed by at least one person who is not a direct family member or related to you. So the green form is technically a provider order. So it's kind of like, as if I were to give you a prescription to go to the pharmacy, it's technically an order. So it's like I'm ordering the emergency personnel to do or not do CPR. So definitely you should have your own copy. Your power of attorney should have a copy. Your doctor and probably your main doctors should have that. You may no knock on dermatologists, but they're usually not dealing with end of life, so they probably don't need to see that. But folks like your cancer specialist, maybe your heart specialist, it'd be important for that. And certainly wherever you consider your main hospital to be. And a lot of nowadays hospitals will ask up front if you have a copy and try to have that on file electronically. Other questions?
Okay, I have a question.
Yes.
Regarding your graph on fatality and dementia,
Yes.
the beginning part, what would you say if a person that's in a nursing or care home with a case of dementia, what would be the lifespan of that person? How many?
So that's a good question. I think that when someone has dementia and lives in a foster or care home, someone where usually it's a certified nurse aide or someone similar, maybe a retired nurse who's running a foster or care home. Usually when they're at that point, they're usually very frail. And there's actually a really good, I should have included it here. It's a little hard to project onto a screen. There's a lot of text, but one thing that I really find helpful, in particular with dementia, can I not get it to show up? Ooh. Oh, here we go. Okay. So there's this system that we as healthcare providers use called FAST, F-A-S-T staging, in particular for dementia. And if you do an image search, there's a lot of different versions, but there's this one that's mostly blue that's really good because, let's see if I can get it to show up a little bit bigger. Will this show up bigger? There we go. So, I like this slide a lot because it talks about the different stages, like here on the left, about the severity of the dementia, and then it talks about the characteristics of the various stages. So it talks about, in the very early part, you can't even tell that there's any dementia, or you just chalk it up to old age in this part, and then you start seeing the things like wrong bills being paid or not being paid, the stove left on, maybe getting lost when they know how to usually catch the bus and they start getting lost more frequently. This is helpful because in an untreated Alzheimer's dementia patient, they have these expected duration in months. So 84 is 7 years. So that's the early part. Most people aren't undergoing intensive treatment or seeing a specialist at this point. Some people are because they really want to. And sometimes it's beneficial too, depending on the situation. And then we start seeing a more rapid decline here in the moderate stage. And then actually in the severe stage, we see it actually start to stretch out, and it lasts years in some of these other stages. So when someone is not speaking very much, wheelchair or bedbound, that can actually last a few years. So people can live in a foster or care home for several years depending on what stage they're in. Most people, I would say, who are in a foster care home are somewhere, usually incontinence is a big deal breaker. Very challenging for family to do at home. They still work. They notice that their loved one is going so frequently and they come home and it's soaked or dirty and their skin starts breaking down and they don't have the resources to take care of them at home or the help. And so a foster care home becomes an option. That's usually when I start seeing a lot of people make that transition. Some people are able to stretch it out. The hard part is usually if it's a heavier person and they become wheelchair bound, they just physically, their spouse or their kids just physically cannot lift them in and out and do those things. And a lot of foster homes are equipped with that special equipment. We can sometimes get that for the personal home too, but often it's a trained person or they have several staff members helping them in the home to do that type of caregiving. You're welcome. Other questions?
I have a question.
Oh, yes.
I was wondering what would happen if someone that I knew is terminally ill, and they're in Sweden right now, but he couldn't handle it anymore. He just wanted to go. But the insurance refused to pay for anything, and the hospital refused to, help him be put to sleep. So the family got together and did a lot of research and found a place in Austria somewhere. They were able to do that, but they had to pay for everything out of pocket. But he did get his wish. So what do we do with that kind of situation here in Hawaii?
Yeah. So that's a great question, and that kind of actually addresses a recent bill that's been passed. There's various names. It's Our Choice, Our Care, I believe. Forgive me if I'm wrong. It's also been called Death with Dignity. There's a lot of different terms for it. I feel very similar to it as Kokua Mau does. I think that in general, when someone is thinking about those choices, I think it's time to actually take a step back and think about, and it's not necessarily anyone's fault, but usually there's an unanswered need in their care, whether that be physical pain, it could be emotional pain, spiritual pain. Often there's something that's missing, and it's hard. When someone's seriously ill and terminally ill, it's hard to look at every single piece of the puzzle. But that might be their way of crying out for help. And so it's a very rigorous process, not only here in Hawaii, but in other states and other countries, where they have to go through multiple tests and multiple evaluations to really ensure that that is the decision they want. It is not a decision to be made lightly. And again, I always encourage families to really step back and think about, is there something that we have not necessarily failed, but maybe overlooked or running a little short of being able to provide to our loved one? That's how I feel about when someone is faced with a terminal illness like that. And the vast majority of people, when people have considered that, a lot of them have either not even really considered hospice, or they have not considered a lot of their options. And so a lot of people end up not choosing to go down that route because it uncovers a lot of stuff that was not addressed or resources that they haven't tried yet. But certainly there are people who have gone through everything, who have gone through all their options, been evaluated several times by several professionals, and still choose that. And I think it is our law in several states and several countries, and we should honor those wishes if that's their honor, if that's their wish. Yes.
I wanted to know if someone has a POLST but does not have an advanced care directive, will the selections in the POLST be followed by the hospital?
In general, yes, because if someone is at that point with a serious illness and they are not able to communicate, because we will always, if a provider, a physician, clinician feels like a patient or person is not able to communicate their desires, their wishes well, they will use the POLST as a guide. And if there's no other existing document that says otherwise, and that POLST is signed by the person or the loved one, the surrogate, then we will trust that as their wish and act upon that. But it is not technically a legally binding document. And so on the back is often emergency contact. That is not necessarily a legal power of attorney, which is why you still should get an advanced healthcare directive, because that legally makes someone your healthcare power of attorney.
Any other questions?
You talked about decreased appetite and weight loss earlier. I noticed that's not on that slide that you just showed, but for the that term cachexia that you talked about.
Is not on which slide? This one? No.
No, it was not on that last fast slide.
The last slide.
The fast slide.
Oh, that. Yes.
But how does one person know that you're in that state of cachexia, or can weight loss be at a much earlier stage in dementia?
That is an excellent question. So when we see someone with a serious illness start to lose weight, it is important for us to do a workup, depending on someone's values and wishes, but to a comfortable extent to make sure that the weight loss or the lack of appetite is not from something else. But I'll give a good example, which is that, let's say grandma is 96, very hard for her to leave the house, already in maybe a foster home and living there. We start to see her lose weight. We do blood tests, everything's normal. Certainly cancer could be a cause of weight loss, but in a 96-year-old living in a foster home, it doesn't make a lot of sense to go looking for the cancer, because a 96-year-old is unlikely to benefit from any type of treatment. And so to put someone through that testing, unless there's a clear symptom like it's blocking or causing pain, it doesn't make a lot of sense to go hunting for a cancer in that situation. So that's an example of when you may not do a complete workup for a weight loss versus someone who's much younger, 50 years old, hasn't been eating very well, has been losing weight, but still potentially with therapy could, if there's a cancer and it's treatable, could get better and return to a pretty good level of function, that makes a lot more sense in that case. But that is a very subjective, value-based assessment. And I think a lot of people end up relying on their doctor for the best advice possible. But it is ultimately up to the person and their legal surrogate to make that decision. I always try to lead off with, if this were my family member, or, if I were in your shoes, I always try to let folks come to their own conclusion first, but a lot of people do end up asking for advice and what to do, because it's not always clear. We don't expect people to know what to do in that situation, but we kind of offer those options.
I have a follow-up to that, because
Yes.
If someone is in an older age,
Yes.
like let's say in their 80s or 90s,
Mm-hmm.
I notice that a lot of healthcare professionals feel like you've lived a long and healthy life, and therefore it's not necessary to go all out and give them the best or most competent treatment.
Mm-hmm.
And that's my reluctance to having that type of document, because I don't want them to feel like they have permission not to give complete treatment because of the person's age. Whereas if they were in their 60s or 70s, it would be a different story.
So I'll ask one clarifying question and then hear your answer, and then try to go into that answer more, and then we do have another question after. Just so one clarification, are you talking also specifically about cancer screening, or just in general, you've lived a long life and so don't do too much unnecessary things?
Well, in reference to someone coming in with pneumonia.
Okay. So I think that's a very good question in asking. I think there is a tendency to use these forms in a different way, not what they were fully intended to do. They sometimes think that DNR equals comfort care. So if I go back to the slide, if someone selects do not resuscitate, that does not equal comfort measures. And if I show up to the hospital, it's send me back home, because you're DNR. Or we're not going to admit you to the hospital, or we're not going to do this or that because of that. I think it is not what this form was intended to do. I think that it's important to think about those values and protest. If you think that your doctor is misinterpreting your wishes, then it's important to make those clarifications, because I think there is, we live in a time where there's a lot of information change and things are changing rapidly, and there's pressure to make everyone fill out one of these forms, and we don't want to rush into this. These decisions and these forms are not meant to be made quickly without a lot of thought put into them. Now, some people have thought about it and it's easy for them to make that decision, but it is important to flush out a lot of those concerns. And I think that, if an older person has pneumonia, the situations can be very different, because, for example, if, let's say, Nana is 85, living at home, still goes to supermarket with her friends, and then gets a pneumonia, and it's her first ever pneumonia, whether it be from swallowing problems or just influenza or some other bacteria in the environment, I think most people would say we need to treat her to the best of our ability to get her through this pneumonia. Now, the situation may be very different for, grandpa who is at a foster home, has lived there for several years, doesn't get out of the chair very much or maybe at all, has been several times for a pneumonia. Overall, the family and probably the person himself, if he were able to communicate, may feel that my quality of life is not that great. And you know what? I have lived a good life, and while every day that my grandkids visit is nice, overall, I've lived a good life, and I'm satisfied with it. And if I were to pass away today, I'm okay with that. And pneumonia is a acceptable way to pass away. It is a common cause, much like much like stroke or dementia or a heart attack, it's a common way to pass away. And not every time that we treat a pneumonia, we always have to think about the risk too. Antibiotics are not without risk. They can cause side effects, really bad diarrhea, confusion, cause disturbances in your salt levels, your blood counts. We have to think about those things in someone who is much more fit versus someone who maybe not as fit or functional. So those are some of the considerations that go into every time someone does get sick, whether it be a serious illness or a temporary but serious illness, like a pneumonia, bad pneumonia. So things to think about. Does that kind of answer your question?
One more question. I think we've got 1 more minute in the back. Last question, please.
Oh, my question's a little bit broader. I'm
Okay.
curious about the geriatric services here, who's on the team, and how are people eligible for the services, and at what point do you introduce or explore the forms we're talking about tonight?
Sure. So Queens has a very comprehensive geriatric service team. We do have a website, and there's also the referral line, which you can call. I don't know the referral line off the top of my head, I'm sorry. But we do have a website, which I believe is, Jess, do you remember? Sorry. That's okay. I'm going to guess here and say that it's queens.org/geriatrics, and I'd be right. Perfect. So, oh, but it's not what I was hoping for. This one maybe? Or this one? This one? Oh. Oh, yes. Here we go. So we have not fleshed out our website. We're not the most technically, oh, here we go. So we do have these services which are listed. In terms of how folks get referred to us, a lot of times it ends up being through their primary care physician. Sometimes it's just a matter of asking your primary care physician. Unfortunately, unlike some of our mainland counterparts, our outpatient clinic does not have the capacity to take people on as their primary care patient. And so a lot of it is consultation, more so than primary care. So we do ask for the majority of our patients to stick with their primary care while we provide that consultation service. We also have a hospital consult service. In general, the way that that works is the physician who's in charge of your care in the hospital will feel that you would benefit from a specialist, versus a post-acute care team is, we have currently staff at 4 nursing homes, and so we try to make that publicly available to families, but a lot of it depends on capacity. Some nursing homes just don't have beds at the time when it's ready to be discharged from the hospital. And then we also have this house call program in which we do visits for homebound patients. So really these are for folks who it is extremely difficult to get out of the home to the office. And so we do make those visits, but we have a limited ability and staff to be able to do that. So we do have to review cases before we accept people into our program with that. There's also some services on Molokai, and that's kind of the main way that people end up in our Queens geriatric services. Well, I really want to thank you all for your time tonight and your attention and your great questions. Really want to say mahalo. There's kokua mau outside, and our staff, I'll be around for some time after to answer additional questions. And we have some pamphlets that also list some of those resources that I talked about at the end of the original part of the talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Tom. We want to also say mahalo to Val Milstein for providing the sign language interpretation. And again, as Dr. Tom said, thanks to Kokua Mau and the Queens Geriatrics Department. They were in the lobby earlier providing the great information. Also, mahalo to our Queens volunteers, Abigail and Laura. Our next free Speaking of Health lecture here is entitled Mental Health 101. For those suffering from mental health issues, the struggles are real and often tough to deal with. They also have the potential to affect everyone around them. However, education and awareness is one positive step towards making the subject a little easier to talk about. Dr. Sarah Hack, a psychiatrist, will talk about the definition of mental health and common mental illnesses. So again, the date for that one is going to be Wednesday, November 20th. Again, Wednesday, November 20th, from 6 to 7 p.m. here at free at the Queens Conference Center. You can register online at www.queens.org. You can click on classes and events, or you can call the Queens referral line at 691-7117. So again, thank you very much for attending the Queens Medical Center's free Speaking of Health lecture. Don't forget about your parking validation. Drive home safely.